It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 54. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and we take a look at the headlines in the world of creationism and dig behind the headlines sometimes. First up, we'll take a look at the Creation Research Society, which is still looking to fill its vacancy COO position. Talk about how Answers in Genesis is leaning into climate change denial. A little bit about trilobites, homo naledi, and perfect design. What does that mean from a creationist perspective? We've got that and more coming up next. I saw someone post this picture just a few weeks ago. Can't even remember who it was, but they posted it on social media, and they said it was a gathering of the board of directors of the Creation Research Society. The Creation Research Society is kind of the, I guess you could say, the professional society for young earth creationists. And I guess they had a recent meeting, and I don't know if they've decided on their COO yet, but it looks like they still have that position open. I'll show you the job description in case you're thinking of applying. You know, what would you need to apply to be in charge of the Creation Research Society? But I show this picture because it gives me a chance to put some faces to some people that I talk about quite a bit on this channel. So over here on the left side, we've got, this is Georgia Purdom. So she's geneticist from the Answers in Genesis. I've got Eugene Chafin back here, retired physicist. We've got, Berger, biologist. This is Jeffrey Tompkins. Jeffrey Tompkins of 88% similarity fame for the DNA differences between humans and chimpanzees. Been much in discussion lately. Back here we've got from Creation Ministries International, that's Rob Carter, who's a geneticist. So we've got Answers in Genesis, we've got Tompkins's ICR, Institute for Creation Research. These two are more independent researchers. Rob Carter, Creation Ministries International. Laura Tain Chan, I've talked about, I've done a whole video on her and her interesting publications. And then back here, we've got Randy Gugliuzza, who is the president of the Institute for Creation Research. And we've got Faulkner right here, who is astronomer at Answers in Genesis. So here we've got Answers in Genesis, Creation Ministries International, and and Institutes for Creation Research, amongst a number of other independent researchers, all gathered in one place. So to that job announcement, just in case you were curious, right? Creation Research Society is looking for a lab director. And they've been looking for one since I think this particular, I saw this announcement probably late spring last year. So a little over a year ago, they posted this on their website. Unfortunately, the reason there's an opening there is because their former director of the past 20 years, Kevin Anderson, succumbed to the COVID virus early last year. And then ever since then, they've been looking for a replacement. So you can see it's director of the Van Andel Creation Research Center. And the director also serves as the chief operational officer of the Creation Research Society. And so brings this group together and organizes the annual meeting and so forth, and oversees the type of research projects that they're working on. So what do you have to be to work, to take this position? You got to be willing to, you have to have these qualifications to be willing to do these things. Got to be a voting member of the Creation Research Society. And of course, to be a member of the Creation Research Society, you're going to have to subscribe to their sort of statement of faith. They have to have an earned doctorate in some recognized scientific discipline, which they prefer, as you see down here toward the bottom, be a biologist or a biochemist. Publish in the scientific literature. They want somebody who's published in the standard, research literature. But they also want somebody who's actually published in the creationist literature too, and so knows the world of publishing in creation journals, because they're going to be overseeing the journal of the Creation Research Society as well. Obviously, they have to agree with the Creation Research Society mission statement. And then they've got to oversee some research that's happening there. They've got funding for that research they have to collect. You notice down there under other qualifications, the lab director must be able to teach university-level biology classes at Arizona Christian University. This would be one way that they're going to support this particular person, is that they're going to have a job at the Arizona Christian University teaching some classes, and that's going to help support their salary. And all of this is a 1-year contract, renewable by the board no later than the annual board meeting. So year-to-year annual re-upping. So somebody needs to uproot themselves, move themselves to Arizona to take on this particular pretty big job, really, in terms of the overall responsibilities on a year-to-year rolling job cycle. And they have to be able to teach classes at a Christian university. I'd say there's not a lot of individuals out there that are probably qualified for this particular position. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. Now, like I said, they just met as a board just a few weeks ago. It's possible that they have somebody in mind now and they're on their way to finding somebody to fill this position, but we'll see. So what's going on over there at Answers in Genesis? Mostly a whole bunch of culture wars articles and articles about the family and other topics like that, right? Very little science stuff. But a week ago, they had their Answers News program, and they touched on a number of things, including homo naledi, which we'll get to in a moment. But the first item that they discussed was a recent paper, and actually they discussed the paper. They discussed the science blurb about it. And the science blurb basically summarizes the paper as, there's a consequence to cutting carbon emissions. Right? By cutting carbon emissions, we reduce the particulates in the atmosphere, in which case more sun actually gets to the surface and then heats the surface more. And so there's actually a danger of causing short-term heat gain in the atmosphere by reducing carbon emissions. Now, in the original paper, they talk about the fact that in the long term, of course, carbon emissions are expected to increase the overall heat budget of the Earth over time, right? Creating climate change or continued climate change. And so, what you might save short term by not cutting carbon emissions, in other words, like if we had more carbon emissions, maybe it would slow down climate change. But if you slow it down, you simply extend climate change out farther into the future. And so the net effect is that it makes climate change worse if you were to not cut carbon emissions. Right? That's kind of the gist of that paper. But of course, Answers in Genesis is never one to pass up what sounds like a good story to a gullible audience, right? And has this title, Carbon Cuts, Will They Make Climate Change Worse? And so they do briefly mention that it's complicated, but they do leave the sense to the audience that, oh, look, we've been told that cutting carbon emissions is the thing we need to do in order to control the climate. And of course, we know we can't control the climate. I mean, that's what they're going to turn around and say is that we can't control the climate. God controls the climate. There's really almost nothing we can do to truly damage or destroy the planet. But they certainly leave the impression of the audience that, oh, so you've been told climate emissions or carbon emissions are bad. But in fact, they might be good because they might be slowing down climate change. If we didn't have these carbon emissions, we might be getting warmer than they had predicted. Now, all this is a preamble for me to say that I want to give you an example of where Young Earth Creationist and Answers in Genesis in particular misuses Scripture. Right? This is a misapplication of Scripture. The host there is talking about this article and then proclaiming that God wouldn't allow the planet to be destroyed and how man really can't change the climate. And in making that argument, she went through a series of Bible verses to try to support her position. And then Ken Ham picks up on that when he writes this blog post. And so here we see in this blog post, Ken Ham claiming that climate change is actually a religion. Man just wants to save himself and thinks he can save the planet, whereas he's not really in control of himself and obviously is then therefore not in control of the planet either because God is. So yeah, the atmosphere and the climate are complex, but God who made it all understands all of that. And therefore, he is in control of the climate and would not allow that climate to change in such a way that would harm man or destroy the planet. And what's the Bible proof of this? What's the Bible verse used here? When the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. And what Bible verse do they go to? And what did they go to in the video? I heard them say, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Genesis 8:22. And the person in the answer new says, well, obviously, the world, God has promised. He's not going to let these things fail, right? And therefore, you don't have anything to fear from climate change. Right? We don't have anything to fear. Man can't destroy the planet. God wouldn't let that happen. Now, when is this verse, recorded? This is recorded right after Noah's flood. Or at least this is the time of Noah's flood, right? They're departing from the ark and God is giving a promise to Noah, right? He's just destroyed the earth. So obviously there was no cold and heat and, well, there was a lot of heat. There was no harvest, for the prior year. And God's saying there will be continual harvest. I can promise that I'm not going to destroy the earth in that way again. And of course, in Ken Ham's language, he's talking about man's going to destroy the earth. We're not talking about climate change destroying the earth in any near-term sense. I mean, even over a couple hundred years, right? But there is concern that man's influence could be changing the environment such that we would feel significant impacts. And that is the idea of climate change and its impacts and its effects. All right, what offends me about Answers in Genesis using this verse is that this is a general statement of God's provision, right, of his providence, saying, I'm in control. It's a general way of saying, here's all the things that are familiar to you. And they will continue to be familiar with you. There's going to be cold and there's going to be heat. There's going to be seed times and there's going to be harvest, right? There's going to be summers and there's going to be winters. There's going to be day and night. None of those things are going to cease. Right? And Answers in Genesis is taking that as if that's a proof text that no changes can happen in the future that would eliminate any of these things. Right? That God is controlled, and we don't have to worry about those types of impacts. All right, so here's my response to that. 400 years in the Answers in Genesis timeline, all right, or the creationist timeline. 400 years after this, there was a global calamity, right? And that calamity was a massive ice age. All right, remember, with creationists have a massive ice age occurring just a few hundred years after the flood. And during that ice age, had you been living where I'm living right now, I would be living underneath a layer of ice all year round. Right? There was no seed time and there was no harvest. There was cold and then there was less cold. I'm not sure I'd call it cold and heat. And there really wasn't a summer, all right? It was basically winter and then some cooler period, which wasn't as bad as winter. So from that local perspective, yes, things changed. There was a dramatic difference in the environment, right? It went from being green and lush and warm, right, where there was seed time and harvest. There was summer and winter, day and night, right? And then that ceased in large portions of the earth, all right, over large portions of the earth. Now, to be very literal, right? And again, as I said, this verse is really just, it's taken together to mean, all right, all the words together are to mean God's providence, right? I am sustainer. I'm the sustainer of things, and I will continue to sustain things in the future. But that sustaining doesn't mean there aren't potentially significant changes, right? All those things will happen, but there could be extremes for those. And we know that because we know that actually happened, right? Answers in Genesis, creationists accept that enormous climate change has occurred after this verse was proclaimed to Noah, right? After this word came to Noah. So after Noah heard this, he was even around to see that the world changed quite a bit. Now, it didn't change so much in the Middle East, right? The Middle East would have gotten milder. We know there were some effects from the Ice Age in that area. It would have shifted the dates of harvests and seed times. It would have been a little bit colder in the winter, but they still would have had hot summers, right? So they still had summer and winter, but it was quite a bit different than it was today, right? So that area has gone through much more climate change than it's experiencing now in the past. And that apparently fits within the context of this promise, right? Clearly, Ken Ham believes that all of that change doesn't negate the truth of this verse. So you can't use this verse to say that there can't be any change in the future, right? That's basically my point, right? It's an inappropriate use of this verse to suggest that somehow there's going to be some, max min that can't be exceeded. You're not going to go above this or not going to go below this. And that's been promised, right? And so therefore, this thing of climate change and the world increasing temperature, 2 degrees or whatever, over the next 100 years, that can't happen. Don't have to worry about that. God wouldn't allow that. But there's still going to be seed time and harvest. There's still going to be cold and heat. There's still going to be summer and winter. There's still going to be day and night, right? Even if the world warmed up 5 degrees or 10 degrees Celsius, right? That would just push us back to the time of some of the dinosaurs. And there were winters and there were summers and there was seed time and there was harvest and there was cold and there was heat and there was day and there was night, even back then. But if the temperature were to change that much over the next 100 years, 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, then we would have melting ice caps. We would have cities that would be drowned. We would have places where we grow wheat now wouldn't be able to handle wheat because it would be too hot there. There'd be other places where we grow wheat, but everything would have to shift around. It'd be very, very dramatic, all right? And that kind of climate change would not change the truth of this verse, in my mind. So anyway, I get kind of upset when creationists use Bible verses somehow as proof text for something that they just don't like in the present, and then they import those ideas into the text. I mean, isn't this what Ken Ham complains about all the time? Doesn't he complain all the time about how scientists or Christians under the influence of science are taking modern science and they're importing it back into the scriptures and they're reinterpreting scriptures to try to massage it so it fits fits our modern day understanding of the world? All right, I'm going to move kind of quickly through a couple different headlines because we're just going to give you a flavor for what's going on with young earth creationism here. So this is Creation Ministries International, creation.com. You can see, an article about how the atmosphere is perfectly balanced, for life, and that's why life can't exist on other planets. We've got the nebular hypothesis, and the reason I'm pointing this one out is because I think this is a Sarfati paper, but it's an article from 2010. And I know 2010 wasn't that long ago, but 13 years ago in terms of astronomy is quite a long time ago. And I look at that article, I read all these different bullet points about how the nebular hypothesis, has all these different issues, and this hasn't been explained, this hasn't been explained, this hasn't been explained. As I read it, I go I'm not an astronomer, but I read enough astronomy literature and I keep up on the headlines that I know no, I know that there's all kinds of work that's been done on that, and I know that this has been seen. I know we've actually now visualized planetary systems and suns and so forth, and in the process of being made under conditions that have been predicted a long time ago by the nebular hypothesis. And so many of the things that he says in there are completely outdated. And I know that this is what these ministries do, and I know this is what a lot of the websites do, right? You can't make brand new content constantly every single day. They try to have something new on the website every day. And so what they do is they just recycle old articles. So it's like a new article and then 3 or 4 old articles from the vault. But you would think you'd want to at least try to make sure you picked out old articles that at least hadn't been completely outdated, so that you don't look like you're not up with the times. That's all I wanted to say about that. Let's go over to ICR, Institute for Creation Research. And I think I said last time, ICR has just been really boring. And I like almost don't even think about going to the website because, for one thing, they don't actually update it every day. It's like every 2 or 3 days they update their site. So there's not a whole lot to look at. So parenthetically, that's why you've got to have new stuff every single day. You got to get people in a rhythm. And once they get out of the rhythm, they might stop looking. And that's kind of where I'm at with ICR. It's like, all right, I'm going to look, but also they're just not pumping out very interesting stuff either. They're recycling a bunch of stuff. They just must not have enough writers right now doing things. But let me just tell you about this one article here, Trilobite demise. Of course, if you know anything about trilobites, trilobites are an exceptionally diverse group of organisms. But they all disappear in the Permian. So they're only in the bottom third of the fossil record. But there was a whole lot of them. And I just talked about extinction in another video, about how young Earth creationists have to believe that God made enormous numbers of different kinds of organisms. Like the Earth was just absolutely chock full of different types of organisms. When you count up the number of different families of organisms that we've named, it's enormous. And then you ask yourself, how many different families of organisms are alive today? And it's a small number compared to the total number of families that we've identified from the fossil record. So from a creationist perspective, there was massive amounts of diversity, and that diversity has been shrunk mostly due to the global flood. But then even after the global flood, apparently has continued to shrink, such that the amount of biodiversity is waning at a precipitous rate. Well, the trilobite thing is just a nice example of that, right? And they're not really highlighting that portion of the article. In fact, I don't. Once again, they're not factual in this article, and it's a rerun of an old article. But even when it was old, I know that their data was wrong. I think it talks about there being 56 different families. And so for young creationists, that means they're suggesting there's 56 different kinds of trilobites that God would have made on day, I don't know, probably day 3. Day 4. And mentions there being about 3,900 species. Well, that's nowhere close, right? It's estimated there's probably at least 100,000 different species of trilobites. And we've named well over 50,000 different species of trilobites, right? Incredibly numerous, fairly easy to identify. They have a lot of characteristics to look at. And so the diversity of trilobites is absolutely enormous. So it makes the story even more compelling, or maybe you could say confusing to young Earth creationists, because here you have 56 different kinds, and within each kind, you might have had 10, 15, 20, 100, 200, 300 different species, all living on the Earth all at the same time, right at the time of the flood. And so let's say you had 50,000 species. Well, I'm going to think it's probably 100,000, but let's just be conservative. 50,000 species of trilobites are alive at the moment that the Great Flood breaks out, right? The Noahic Flood breaks out. And all 50,000 species, meaning every individual in all those species too. So hundreds of billions of trilobites all are killed by Noah's flood, and not a single one of those species is able to survive. Lots of other oceanic critters have survived Noah's flood, otherwise we wouldn't have any oceanic critters, right? Because they weren't on Noah's Ark. And yet 50,000 different kinds or 50,000 different species all just disappear. And they all disappear early in the flood too, because they're not even found up in upper layers. All right, I'm running kind of long, so I've already done a whole nother video on homo naledi, creating art and so forth. But after I did that video, which was based on an Answer the News thing, Ken Ham wrote a short blog post, and then he reiterated the same thing that I said there, which is that they doubled down, right? They have been saying that homo naledi is just nothing but an ape, right? Has no relationship to Adam and Eve. And so what do they make of this new find? They say, did an ape bury its dead with rituals, mark graves with caves, with carvings, and use fire? Those are the claims in the new articles that have come out. Well, when it comes down to interpretation, these researchers who already believe that homo naledi is on the path to becoming human-like interpret these carvings, remains of fire, and more as being left by homo naledi. But is there another interpretation that matches the evidence? Absolutely. Humans. Humans are the only known beings to bury their dead with rituals, carve meaningful symbols, and use fire. And therefore, since they're the only things that are known to do that, they must have been the ones that did it. In other words, a priori, we've decided that homo naledi is not at all related to human. They can't be human at all. And therefore, since we found things that look like they could only be made by humans, and only humans can make those, then the humans must have made those. So humans came into that cave afterwards and buried some of the bones of homo naledi and made fires and made the artwork. And we know that's true because homo naledi isn't human, so therefore couldn't do that. You see the circuit of reasoning here for Ken Ham? He's not looking at the evidence and asking, does it look like these different things, these cultural and cognitive abilities, look like they're associated with the bones that are in the cave? If they are, maybe we should associate human-like behavior with those bones, and then they should just call them human, or descendants of Adam and Eve, or descendants of Noah. But no, because they've already proclaimed the bones based on just looking at the bones as not being human, they then have to do this circuit or argument where they're going to force another interpretation on that data, all right, without considering this new evidence at all. Yeah, it's an interesting contortion. What makes it more interesting, of course, as I pointed out, that other young Earth creationists were proclaimed that these bones actually belong to human beings. And so when these new findings of graves, of carvings, of fire use, when all that information came out later, they was like, well, okay, that's fine. We already thought they were humans, and so humans do those things, and so we don't have to change our theory at all. But Answers in Genesis kind of forced into like this contorted, well, how can we explain all this stuff? Is there another interpretation? Well, yes, there is another interpretation. It's just not a very likely interpretation, but we're going to have to go with that very unlikely interpretation. Creation.com. Creation.com had another article. Is the world perfectly designed? And for any follower of mine knows that, I think a lot about this word perfect. What does perfect mean? And what does a perfect world look like? Answers in Genesis often references the idea that the original creation was perfect, right? Not just very good, but they actually use the word perfect at times. And what would a perfect world look like? What do perfect organisms look like? Since they don't believe there was any death, and how would the ecology of the world work? How would organisms relate to one another? And what are all the organisms' features for? Right? That's why they have to have explanations for, like, why have sharp teeth, right, that look like carnivorous teeth when they're not necessary? Why have spines? Why have protective features on organisms? Why have defensive features if you don't need to defend yourself because the world is perfect, based on sort of this, whatever their definition is of perfect? And that's the problem I have, is it's hard to define that word perfect. And so creation.com got a question from a user, right? It's believed that we're made with intelligent design or perfect design. In so what way? Right? What about vestigial organs? Are those structures described as being useless, poorly made, left like the recurrent laryngeal nerve? What about the structures, which they say are mistaken byproducts of evolution? Consider these things, and it's still possible to say this is intelligent design. Right? So they're asking really good questions there. And so what's the response from creation.com? To say that we're made with intelligent design is different than saying that we're made with a perfect design. Right? They're going to try to separate this word perfect from intelligent. Nobody would deny that computers, fighter jets, and MRI machines are intelligently designed, but are they perfectly designed? Well, they're made by humans. There's almost certainly going to be some flaw in the design. All right, so God, though, is perfect, so he could make a perfect design. But what does it mean to be perfect? If we use the term perfect with respect to how nature runs, we might refer to the pre-fall world as perfect in the sense of lacking evil. Well, that's a very general sense of perfect. Oh, there's no evil here. But what then is evil? What is natural evil? What is moral evil? The quote over here. What matters from a design perspective is not whether something is perfectly designed, but whether that design is successful at achieving the functions it's aimed at achieving. What matters is not that something is perfectly designed, but whether the design is successful. Interesting way to define perfection, really. It's the success, right? Does it achieve its function? Does it achieve its aim? In other words, God had a purpose for all the different features of organisms, and if they're achieving that purpose, that's the perfection of the system, rather than the actual design itself. Boy, that's really complicated to say. It almost doesn't, as I'm saying it, it kind of doesn't make sense, but I'm actually reading what's written over here on the side, on the left side. Not whether something is perfectly designed. Let me go to the next page because I'm going to give you an example of this. And this is what caught my attention. A single feature may not be optimal. A single feature, so like a single characteristic, could be a morphological characteristic, or it could be a particular enzyme. And that enzyme might not be exactly optimal. It might not be working to its absolute best ability. I could look at an enzyme and say, like, I could imagine how to tweak that thing and make it work twice as fast, right? As if maybe faster is better. But again, that's me determining what the value is and what the purpose is. But the combinations of features may be. A single feature may not be optimal, but when you combine multiple features, that might create an optimal situation. So here's their example. A thicker shell, considered only for its protective properties, works better against predators, right? If a turtle has a thicker shell, then it's more protected against predators. Great. Thicker shell is better. All right. It's more optimal in that environment. Again, the reference is to the environment, though. But a too thick shell wastes manufacturing resources, and it could weigh down the creature, so the overall creature is worse off. Right? If you're an insect and you want to be more protected, maybe you want to have a thicker cuticle, but if you have a thicker cuticle, it makes it heavier and it makes it harder to fly, and then you're going to waste more energy, right? You're using more energy. A turtle, if it has a massively thick shell, is going to expend more energy carrying around that shell, right? That might not be considered optimal. All right. Indeed, one engineering textbook on machine component design points out that most engineering designs involve a multitude of considerations, and it's a challenge to the engineer to recognize them all in proper proportion. Yeah. Okay. All right. Do you know where I'm going with this? Right. In the original creation, thicker shell or thinner shell, which is better? Well, the organism can't die. Presumably has all the food that it needs. What determines what is the best shell thickness or the best rate at speed at which an organism can walk or fly, or where their eyes are? I've done a video on, eyes forward are generally predators, and eyes on the sides, like in rabbits, are organisms that are prey, right? But in the garden, right, in the original creation, if there was no death, there was no predation, then what is the function of having eyes on the side, right? If maybe having eyes in the front, having binocular vision might be more enjoyable or seem better for the organism. Again, defining better is hard, right? Especially in a perfect environment. Like, what does perfect mean? Right? How can you even judge what character is better than another character? Like, ultimately, the creationist, I think, who wants to say that the world was perfect just has to rely on God made it that way and has his purpose in doing that. And I can't really fully understand that purpose, because you really can't, because you can't actually study that thing and say like, oh, I know why it has that, because that was good for this particular thing in its environment and how it's interacting. Because most of the features you see in organisms, like eyes on the side for rabbits, once there is death, right? Once sin is entered into the world, you're going to go like, oh, I get it, right? They need to be able to have a much larger peripheral vision in order to see what's coming after them, give it a better chance of survival. Same thing with this example right here. They just went and used an example that basically explains natural selection, or what natural selection is doing and how it adapts organisms in this world. A thicker shell is good for protective properties, works against predators and environmental damage. Too thin of a gel, too thin, and but too thick, and you're wasting manufacturing resources. You're putting too much energy into that. And if you put too much energy into making your shell, and so, yeah, I survived, but I don't have enough energy to mate, well, then you're not going to pass that information down to the next generation. The next generation is not going to have a thicker shell, right? But if it's too thin, you're going to potentially have environmental damage, and environmental damage include being eaten as well. And therefore, you're not going to reproduce, and you're not going to send the genetics forward for making a thinner shell. So what gets passed to the next generation? Some kind of environment basically selecting for the right a combination, right? The combination of features that work. But there is no natural selection like that in the original creation, right? The original creation before the fall, where there's no death of these animals, and all of them are procreating. So whether I have a thick shell or whether I have a thin shell, I'm going to procreate probably the same way and have the same success rate. And so unless you're going to start arguing there's some form of natural selection there, perfection is an elusive term, and it just ends up being, well, the way it was is the way it was, and that was perfect. And I can't actually describe what's perfect about those characteristics because I have no reference point. What makes this character better than another? What makes this enzyme working at this rate better than an enzyme working at a different rate in that organism? If their survival doesn't really depend on it. This is a really complex thing to think about, and but I hope you see the sense of where I'm going with this in terms of teasing out what gives characteristics meaning. All right, last up, my fun but frustrating item of the week. I just noticed on YouTube a short video, and it's Ken Ham's son-in-law, Bodhi Hoj. 1 minute video on YouTube, right? And here's the title. Evolutionists will never tell you this about dinosaurs. They've really gotten into the dramatics in terms of their labeling of their videos. Evolution will never tell you this about dinosaurs. And I thought, well, what are they not willing to tell other people about dinosaurs? I click on it and I listen to the 1 minute, a wasted 1 minute of my life. And I learned from this video that all he's doing is promoting his book about dinosaurs and dragons. And as he's talking about, he's saying, did you know that there is a scientific definition for dinosaurs? And that scientific definition for dinosaurs has to do with their hips and the fact that they're holding their bodies up off the ground versus being more prostrate like a crocodile or a lizard. And so that's how we know what a dinosaur is, right? Because we've defined it that way, and that's what dinosaurs are. There is a definition for dinosaurs. And then he proceeds to tell them, learn more about dinosaurs by reading my book. What exactly is it that evolutionists are never going to tell you about dinosaurs? Are you saying that evolutionary biologists, just another way of saying scientists, paleontologists, have never defined a dinosaur? I mean, where did he get the definition? He got the definition, all right, from other scientists. He didn't make that definition up. He's saying, here's what I know about what I've learned about dinosaurs. Scientists, he said it. Scientists say that there's a scientific definition. Well, so scientists said it. So what exactly is it that evolutionists will never tell you about dinosaurs? I am totally confused after watching that 1 minute video. I saw absolutely nothing in that video that I thought would have been information that anybody would think twice about withholding, or that anyone would ever think to withhold or has ever withheld from any of you about what dinosaurs are. It was just really silly. I don't get it. I don't understand why the dramatics with some of these videos. It's really selling something that doesn't exist in the video at all. All right, we got to quit there. Thanks for hanging out with me this week in creationism. It's been a little, I can admit, it's been a little dull the last couple of weeks. I don't know if it's the summer doldrums in young Earth creationism, but the news out of creationism is just, I don't know if they just don't have enough to react to, or they're just not publishing much new stuff. Are they just not writing as much? It's just a whole bunch of retreads and a bunch of culture war stuff. So, but I'll keep my eye on it, and we'll see what we come up with next week. All right, thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.